Back live tonight on In Focus, and thanks for staying on. There are growing calls for the public service to move away from political influence. This after a recently unveiled report found that the ANC cadre deployment policy exploits the structure in which government is organized, ultimately affecting service delivery. For more on this, we are joined by Public Service Commissioner Dr. Somadoda Fikeni to look closely into that. Good to have you, Dada, and thank you very much for your time. I suppose the report that was launched in early March would be looking particularly at municipalities and metros governed by one party, which is the ANC, which would use patronage to dispense to its members and so on and so forth, affecting particular positions in which they deploy the cadres. How does this work in a context where smaller parties are voting with opposition parties in exchange for particular positions at these municipalities, where we are seeing now more and more hung municipalities than, for example, what we saw in 2016?
Well, it can be extremely destabilizing if you base the appointment of your professionals and public servants on the basis of who is a politically dominant player, especially at the time when the country, as a natural consequence of the proportional representative system, is moving towards a coalition arrangement on more frequent basis. So it is for that reason that it is timely that professionalization of public service framework has been approved. And that in itself will emphasize on merit, will emphasize on competence rather than loyalty to any particular administration or political party. In that way, a professional public service will respect, will interpret, will implement any mandate of a governing coalition, of a governing majority party, but at the same time without necessarily being political. That allows for the situation where when one administration is replaced by the next administration, it would do so without major destabilizing effects that we've seen in the past. But it also helps at another level. You deliver the services because you have a competent cohort of professionals. It helps at another level. If you look at the state capture report by Justice Zondo and several other corruption reports, the issue of patronage networks, which had even become more fragmented in a factionalized intra-party environment, had not served the state, had not served national interest, but rather served particular individuals and allowed for the overriding of the established laws.
Yeah. How do those then who seek to mitigate these political patronage networks, like yourself, the Public Service Commission, and others? I mean, even government itself speaks of this. President Ramaphosa speaks of this professionalization of the state. How do you then intervene at that level where these coalition agreements are actually signed in the dark? So we don't, as we sit right now, know what these parties promise each other.
There are two parallel processes that ought to take place. That we are now facing the inevitable frequency of coalition governments, minority governments, means that we need a regulatory framework that will govern the transactions between parties and arrangements between them, and ideally make them more transparent. That's a political process that should be parallel to the reforms of public service. Those reforms of public service will also help in creating the ecosystem of meritocracy, wherein different institutions of oversight and institutions supporting democracy, such as your Chapter 9, Chapter 10, Chapter 13 institution, such as your law enforcement, work together, make sure that you do have a professional service that works irrespective irrespective of who is in power. So those are two processes. One would be in the hands of political leaderships, of political parties, and some degree of maturity of looking and envisioning the future where individuals do not matter more than the institutions. Therefore, institutionalize coalitions rather than individualize them. Equally so with professionals, institutionalize professional norms and standards rather than individualize them.
Institutionalize professional norms and standards. Are you concerned as the Public Service Commission by the lack clearly of vetting? I mean, at this particular level is of a speaker, I suppose is a political appointment, and of a mayor, where there was certain vetting that was supposed to have happened that did not happen. But that's one aspect. And then there are other aspects, for example, where a CEO is appointed to an agency of government looking after roads, and it's found that he went in with a PhD that is dodgy, kind of situation. And how do you tighten that process? As you're saying, you're professionalizing, and you've got politicians who are less than honest, even about their qualifications.
Well, I do think that it calls upon all institutions that are looking into that space to actually learn from these examples in terms of vetting and begin to tighten that. If it is in the Public Service and Administration, the Department of Public Service and Administration, we will work closely with them because we're pointing out some of these gaps to make sure that regulations are issued that begin to tighten this process. But equally so, it is very important that the vetting processes, whether it is clearance at a lighter version or deep level vetting, the security cluster or any entities that are dealing with that move with speed, because you have seen instances where they say the Commissioner of Police has not received security clearance after 2 years or so. And that cannot be. Similarly with the qualifications, the rules are very clear. Similarly with people who are facing all other challenges that might limit them from participation. Out of these examples, we ought not to be paralyzed by them and be horrified, but instead go to the drawing board and say, all involved institutions, what lessons do we learn from this? If IEC, for example, looks at the list of people who are to qualify as candidates, in the municipalities, in the provincial or national government, how can it be assisted with greater degree of verifications and so forth? Political parties themselves should also play some role in a more prominent way.
Yeah. How will they? Because, I mean, one gathers that politicians, being politicians, also use this information as leverage, so to speak, to use those who are appointed to these positions so that they remain indebted to them as long as they keep their secret a secret.
Well, what may happen is that if parties would have known that the person had not, gone through some levels of vetting, and they use that to keep quiet when it is okay, they should receive some degree of sanction, one would think. But at the same time, the issue of public embarrassment when such things do happen are also issues, especially if they knew at a certain point. And then because you have political differences, this is then whipped up. That is a painful indictment in general terms. But what is most important is what has happened in the city of Tshwane or in the Johannesburg Road Agency and so forth. But more important, what lessons we learn out of it. And that in itself, if we do something about it, we will have corrected a mistake. But if we do nothing about it, we will be accomplices.
So there was a whole lot of noise being made around the audit of qualifications of of public servants. I think you and I also maybe at some point had a conversation or two about that particular process. It seems to have had traction at that point, but is now dead in the water. I mean, maybe because Labour would have come in there to say, well, you can't now just summarily dismiss people because you're saying they like a particular paper. Maybe they've been doing that job for years.
Not at all. The Public Service Commission requested that information from Department of Public Service and Administration. Yes, it took a bit of time for that information to come. Now that we have received that information, we're busy in the process of verifying those facts with the respective departments. And at the point where we can prove that these are people who are in positions without qualifications, we are not going to let this go. We'll go back to the departments to show some remedial actions in that sense. If it's legacy issues which people were taken to certain positions before the requirement were made, we would then be talking to the National School of Government and the relevant institutions to say what kind of capacity building is needed. It cannot be that once such information is shown, we look the other way. And if we are in the process of rebuilding, that principled and consistent focus on the issues should be there. We should not be headline obsessed. When something has stopped being topical, we look the other way. We should run the full distance. Reforms are a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah. Is it the view then of the Public Sector Commission that you want the appointment process or even the recruitment process to be completely independent of the politicians? So, because what we hear, for example, now is that there will be a political party representative sitting in that appointment panel who, from what we're hearing, holds a whole lot of power and can even sway a whole adjudication panel the direction of what the party wants, because, of course, the party wants to fulfill its own mandate and its own objectives.
What professionalization framework is proposing, and if implemented, it will make a big difference. One, creation of a single administration, as our constitution had actually instructed. That means at local government level, at provincial and national, in the state-owned companies, you would have a seamless, standardized system. That's the first thing. Because right now they are fragmented. They are ruled by different norms and standards. The second one, where we say heads of departments and the DGs, yes, we are in negotiations with SALGA on how it cascades down to the municipalities. And once that is done, one of the things proposed by the framework of professionalization is saying, even where you have political heads for positions such as your DG, HOD, perhaps it would be municipal manager and so forth, we need to actually standardize the fact that you must have a panel of experts in that particular area. And that panel of experts should actually be drawn from professional bodies, should be drawn from the relevant professional bodies, so that even if you have the political heads, the executive authorities sitting around the table, people who are area experts are there, and they're even able to issue an expert report to that effect. So we hope, as it is the standard elsewhere in different countries that have professionalized public service, we hope that in itself will make sure that you produce competence, you produce a meritocratic system that is not very much swayed by the patronage networks that you refer to.
How far are we from that environment?
The professionalization framework has now been approved by the Cabinet, and we are working together with the National School of Government, Department of Public Service and Administration, towards producing an implementation framework that implementation framework will include consultations, extensive consultations with affected institutions such as SALGA for local government and such as the departments. And it will also involve professionals and people who are experts in public administration to make an input, because in South Africa we've produced grand policies, but at the point of implementation they choke and die. So we want to make sure this time around that the implementation plan has timelines, has milestones, and is resourced.
Dr. Fikeni, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us tonight here on In Focus. That's the Commissioner at the Public Service Commission, Dr. Somadoda Fikeni.